Mr. President, having previously served in the United States Senate, I came to the floor once again, for the second time, as a freshman senator in the early months of 2011, full of optimism and a sense of purpose. Back for a second time, as a newly elected freshman, I delivered my inaugural speech, which included the following thoughts. For each of us serving today, I believe it is our duty to rise to the immediate challenge and resolve the problems which now confront us. It will take all of us uniting behind a common purpose that above all else, we must first restore and strengthen our fiscal security. We must articulate a clear vision, set specific goals, and make the tough decisions needed to bring our nation out of debt and preserve prosperity and opportunity for future generations. Those remarks outlined a major part of my vision for what I hope to achieve during my term here as a United States Senator. It is now 7 years later. What I came back to try to accomplish hasn't been accomplished. At the time, I saw, and the reason why I answered the call to come back, was I saw that our fiscal health was eroding right before our very eyes. And I didn't want to be part of the first generation of Americans to leave our children with a country worse off than the one we inherited. Anyone who reads through our history knows of the sacrifices that have been made by generation after generation after generation, so that their children and their grandchildren and their country could be in a better position, so that they wouldn't be saddled with the burdens that might not allow them to live the American dream. I asked Hoosiers to send me back to Washington to focus on taking on these essential issues. It was the first thing in my very first debate where I put it on the table. I said, unless we go back and address our runaway mandatory spending and entitlement programs, it's not worth going back. And I will not ask you to send me back there unless you give me the mandate that this is a task that has to be undertaken. It was called political suicide at the time. Oh, you can't bring that up. I mean, those that are on Medicare, or Medicaid, or Social Security will make sure that you'll never be sent back to the United States Senate if that is what your goal is. I said, I just want every Hoosier to know when they walk in that voting booth that what you're voting for and what you're not voting for. And I received the mandate to come back to address that because people in my generation understood that the privileges that they had received and the opportunities they had received throughout their life, they wanted to pass on that same opportunity to their children and their grandchildren. And they wanted us to come back and make difficult decisions so that that would happen. Now, it's not that this issue wasn't worked on. Whether it was Fix the Debt or the Business Roundtable, Domenici-Rivlin, Simpson-Bowles, the Gang of Six, the Super Committee resulting from the Budget Control Act, and the Dinner Club of Senators, all of these efforts over the early years, I threw myself into, in support of, and many of us, and even on a bipartisan basis, many of us were working together to try to address this gorilla in the room, the runaway mandatory spending. Now eating up over 70% of our total budget and an ever-decreasing discretionary spending. The president, unfortunately, walked away from every effort that was made. The effort where we divided, where nearly 40 of us, 20 Democrats and 20 Republicans, sent the president a letter stating we need to address that and we're willing to step up and address this if you will join us in this process. I was very much a part of the final effort with the president, the so-called Dinner Club, at the president's initiative, in working with the president himself and his chief of staff and his top director of OMB, now Secretary Burwell at HHS, and his political director. And over the months, 8 of us met privately, no press, no staff, working to see as principals if we could come up with something. And in the end, it fell apart. It fell apart because the president, in the end, wouldn't even accept his own previous proposals, his own White House proposals to address this problem. And here we are 7 years later. And currently what we've gone from, and under this administration, 10.6 trillion, 10.6 trillion debt at the beginning of this presidency, now 18 plus, almost 18.2 trillion, almost a doubling in just one term, 2 terms of one president, almost a doubling of our debt. And here we stand with injunctions from the Congressional Budget Office saying we're headed toward a crisis. It is holding down our economy. We're not growing as we should and putting people back to work as we should because this is a drag on us. It's an anchor holding us down. And every member of this Senate understands that the issue here is not this particular program or that particular program. The issue here is runaway mandatory entitlements that is eating up everything that we, virtually 3/4 of everything that they spend money on. There are essential functions of the federal government that have to be addressed. The National Health Service and obviously our defense and national security, CDC dealing with communicable diseases, the education funding, veterans programs, law enforcement, border security, food safety, just to name a few. Those are essential functions. But the money available to do what government needs to do is ever shrinking in terms of our ability to allocate that to being done. And the mandatory spending is just simply running out of control. Is anyone in this Senate or in this Congress saying we should end Social Security, end Medicare, end Medicaid? No. Everyone here has to understand, however, to preserve those programs, we have to bring in sensible reforms to do that. And that has been the challenge. CBO earlier this year said, and I quote, "Large and growing federal debt will have serious negative consequences, including increasing federal spending for interest payments, restraining economic growth in the long term, giving policymakers less flexibility to respond to unexpected challenges, and eventually heightening the risk of a fiscal crisis." The evidence that we read and talk about here every day comes to the same conclusion. Congress too often has governed to avoid a crisis and failed to make the tough but necessary choices. And now here we are, yet another crisis looming, another leverage for us to use to try to achieve some sensible forward movement in terms of dealing with this runaway mandatory spending. And this is the raising of the debt limit. You know, given all the failure of previous efforts, the exhaustion of the private sector and congressional efforts, we're left with very few options to address our fiscal problems. And now here we have a debt limit that's hitting us just days from now, November 3rd, which we won't be able to pay our bills unless we raise that debt limit. So what have we done using this potential leverage to try to achieve something of significance? We end up basically waving the right flag and saying, there's really nothing more we can do. We just simply have to raise this. We have to live with it. We have to continue spending more. Oh, and by the way, those caps that we put in terms of discretionary spending, we got to break those also. There is a legitimate argument for the need to provide additional funding for our Department of Defense and our national security. You know, all you have to do is turn on the television and watch what's happening around the world to understand that America is in a weakened position and that national strength and defense strength is important for the future of our country. And so I do think that was a legitimate issue to try to deal with. But to break the caps on an equal basis for more government spending on the discretionary side simply is something that we shouldn't have to do. And these so-called pay-fors that were put out there are the same old, same old. It's spend now, and maybe we'll adjust the program later, and that'll help cover the cost now. That hasn't worked before. It won't work now. It is a gimmick in most instances. It's something to sell the program, but it doesn't begin to address the problem of out-of-control debt. Along with that, Social Security disability, the trustees have said, is going to go broke in just a few months. And benefits are going to have to be dramatically cut unless it's fixed. So do we come in with a real fix for the real future of a Social Security related program? No, we transfer money from the old age fund into, actually, there is no money in that fund. We just simply allocate the money that is owed to that fund to pay for solvency for the disability part of that fund. And for those, we have, first of all, what we need to do, to be honest with the American people, is to rename the Social Security Trust Fund into something else. Because the trust tells us that there is money there to pay these benefits, and there isn't. There are IOUs there, locked in a box somewhere or a safe somewhere that simply piles up pieces of paper saying, we have to pay you back at some point. And without addressing this, and we saw this last evening in the debate, those of us who watched, I was going back and forth, to be truthful, between the World Series and the debate, trying to catch both of those. We saw a few members stand up and tell the truth. Tell the American people exactly what the situation was and why we needed to do what we need to do. And I commend those few that really had the courage to go forward and tell the American people straight up, this is a problem, it must be solved. Anyway, speaking of this vote that's coming up, the vote that will allow more spending for federal programs that are, many of which are not priority programs. The arrangement, which will simply say, take a pass on raising the debt limit. We're not going to use it as leverage to try to achieve anything meaningful in terms of entitlement. Frankly, offsets that we've used before, we use over and over again, the same old shuffle game where we move pieces around, but it doesn't accomplish the purpose. All of that leads me to the conclusion that I cannot support this particular arrangement. There are reforms that must be put in place, and we have to get to the point where we stop talking about these reforms and put them in place, where we make the political decisions that I believe will be supported back home. But even if they aren't supported by everyone back home, even if they are distorted by organizations that are funded by trying to scare seniors into the Congress or the government taking away their benefits, which is not the case. We're trying to save those benefits, and we're trying to put our future generation, our children and grandchildren, in a better position so they won't be so saddled with that debt. There are many ways that we can go forward. We've talked about balancing our budget. What entity in the world doesn't have to balance a budget at some point that can keep borrowing money and saying on a piece of paper, we'll pay it later, we're going to spend it now and pay it later? What businessman or woman, what small business, medium business, large business, what family, what organization continue to deal with their fiscal issues the way the federal government deals with its fiscal issues and survive? We are careening toward a crisis. There are solutions to this, and it takes political will. And we've seen far too little of that political will. And more importantly, it takes support from both branches of government, both the legislative and the executive, if we're going to accomplish this. And unfortunately, it appears now we're going to have to wait for yet another presidency, yet another Congress, by another kicking the can down the road. Let's dump this problem on the next group coming in. Boy, I feel for whoever wins the presidency, whether it's Democrat or Republican, what they have to inherit, given the damage that has been done here over the past several years. Clearly, we need to address the gorilla in the room. Clearly, we need to stand up, be truthful with the American people, as some of our candidates were last evening, and tell them exactly where we are, what we need to do, and put the long-term reforms in place that will save these programs and put America in a solid fiscal situation. So getting a balanced budget amendment in place is something that we've talked about, we've made efforts, and we need to continue that, because without the discipline of putting your hand on the Bible in your right hand and swearing that you will uphold the Constitution of the United States, and it includes balancing your budget, not spending more than we take in, we will never get there. You've got to put people under oath in order to achieve that, and we've come close on a couple of occasions, but unfortunately not close enough. I therefore am resorting to a program that has worked in the past regarding our national defense and our military, and proposing that what we do is create another, what's called a BRAC. A BRAC was the Base Realignment Commission, that through a process and procedures that we had finally agreed to, because there was no way you could touch or close anything, and we were just overrun with excess spending and excess bases in the United States, and it worked. It worked very, very well. All of us here know exactly, or very closely, to what the parameters of that was. In this case, I think that if we cannot summon the courage and the will to stand up and do this as we are required to do under the oath of office that we take, but we avoid doing, we should then turn to a commission that would provide a budget reduction accountability commission. We can use the same BRAC title on the thing. So let's call it the Budget Reduction Accountability Commission, which will bring forward a plan to achieve the goal of bringing us back to fiscal health and put it before this Congress, both the Senate and the House, with a straight up or down majority vote, yay or nay. Here's the plan. You haven't been able to do it yourself. You've tried it. We appreciate your trying it, but it's come up short, whether it's the executive branch or the legislative branch. So the outside commission presents us the path forward, and we say yes or no. And then the people back home will know exactly where we stand in terms of the future fiscal health of this country. They'll know exactly where we stand in terms of how we want to leave our legacy to the next generation and future generations, how we want to treat our children and our grandchildren. And each member will have to go home and not talk about procedures and not talk about bumping up to the crisis level of spending, and we have to do something to avoid a government shutdown or avoid chaos or avoid economic collapse. Every member will go home and say, you were presented with a plan to get you there. Are you for it or are you against it? And nobody can say, well, we had to do this, we had to do that, it was late, we bumped up against the ceiling, it was running out, and so forth. I'm just tired of hearing all that kind of stuff. So, Mr. President, clearly, solutions exist to deal with this problem. Clearly, we must summon the courage to set aside politics and do what we all know we need to do and suffer the consequences. I think the consequences will be applause and support, because finally someone stands up and says, we're going to fix this problem for the future of America and the future of our children and grandchildren. And we're going to take that risk. And if the groups outside that are going to rally against this kind of thing try to take us down, yeah, fine. We'll go down doing the right thing. But I think we'll be rewarded for doing it. Mr. President, I want to close this today with the same words that I used to conclude my inaugural speech in 2011, where I said, I am standing here today to find solutions, to make the hard decisions, and to leave behind a country that is stronger and more fiscally secure for future generations. This crisis is not insurmountable. We can overcome it by doing what great generations before us have done, mustering our will to do what's right. If we do, I know America's greatest days are not behind us, but still ahead of us.